right. My selection of books is often kind of random, and I've been reading this one for a while. Finished it recently. It's kind of interesting. I picked it up, from a little free library, and it's fairly old. It's 2006 era, and you'd say, well, why are you reading, a history of the 21st century that ended in 2006? Yeah, it's a good question. Friedman is an interesting fellow. I've seen him, for 20 years or so on TV or news shows. And when I say TV, I usually mean on my computer. Certainly nowadays, but previously he would show up as a talking head on things, and he still does. But at this particular point, he was basically writing about globalization. And why am I talking about this book? Well, because I read it just recently, but it influenced my America's Fucked videos along with along with all the experiences of my life. But in particular, the two things that really kind of triggered them was I was reading this, and I was walking through what used to be a homeless encampment. I mean, we had a huge tent city in one of our parks during the worst of the COVID period, and they closed it up, which meant people moved all over the fucking place instead, and every fucking street corner. And I'm not just talking downtown. I'm talking residential neighborhoods and stuff has tents in it. Just people living all over the place, and they're playing whack-a-mole if a little tent city shows up someplace and starts getting really garbagey. After about 3 months, they come in, they put fences around it and say you can't be here, and then a half block away it springs up down there. I mean, there's just you can't solve the problem by just chasing people away. They need a place to live, and they need a place to stay, and unless you take more drastic chasing away measures, you're just not going to do it. And this is a very homeless friendly town. I'll give it that. That may be the problem. Back in 2007 or so, it wasn't. It was one of the more homeless friendly towns at that point, but there wasn't the kind of homelessness that there is. Anyway, back to the book. So, Friedman makes a number of arguments and divides this up. He comes up with 10 flatteners. And they're not all globalization, but they're all things that contributed to it. Some of them technological, some of them political, like the Berlin Wall falling, India opening up and deregulating a little bit, China's push towards the economy, towards a more capitalist economy. And yeah, I mean, that part of it is fine. I have very little I would disagree with in what he says there. This is something he had been following for a while. You might quibble here and there, but overall he's giving you what happened. Then he goes into discussing America in particular and the benefits and challenges we face. And unfortunately, this is 2006. He's saying, hey, we're failing to make ourselves competitive in this kind of globalized, or as he puts it, flat world. I don't really like the term, but whatever. Where every country is on kind of an equal footing. So if you're bringing low-waged workers to the marketplace, well, you're going to get the jobs that low-wage workers can get. And if you're bringing moderately effective, educated workers, you're going to get the jobs that they can get. Which means basically, all the manufacturing type work is not going to be held in the U.S. And that was already the case in 2006. He recognizes that kind of effect had already taken place. But what he looks at is, well, you know, what you're seeing is even higher tech jobs are moving out into China, into India, and we're not going to be able to compete with those particularly either. There's going to be a flattening of the wages there as well. You know, I don't know if I've actually seen that, but certainly, you know, I got downsized because a team of people in India that we trained could do the same job, essentially. A little bit iffy there. I would argue that there's some cultural factors that are going to make a team like ours was not work the same way, and it's going to actually open up some risk to the company. But obviously, management did not see it that way. They didn't really have a good view of how our team operated and why it would not operate as well in a culture without a willingness to challenge as much. But the most interesting thing, perhaps, in the whole book is, you know, what is going wrong with the U.S. and the fact that, you know, we're not educating people in the right things, and we're not really preparing and doing the things that are necessary, making people capable of bridging gaps, bridging capabilities so that they could better link what's needed locally with this sort of global chaining. And that, you know, we're just not prepping our students properly in the technologies, et cetera, so that they can be the next new innovation. And then we're going to lose the race there and whatever. Also, our failures in terms of dealing with new energy sources, where other countries are getting ahead in that. Let's see what else he looked at. I mean, he looked at corporations and how they deal with this, the developing companies. Another really interesting aspect of it was the geopolitics of this. And, you know, here he got some interesting things. And so one of the things he did was he compared a number of countries to the Near East and Middle East, where you're looking at, you know, the Arab world in particular, how it is really one of the least capable areas of the world in terms of how people are reacting, etc., how they're failing at globalization more than anyone else, and how this was a sparking event towards 9/11, towards the radicalization and violence there, because people who think that they have no hope start putting their eggs more into more spiritual things, to tell you the truth. And I mean, look at it, you know. If a country is happy and everybody's doing well and everything, yeah, you might grumble about some stuff, but for the most part, you're not going to try to overthrow the government, you know. You're not going to turn to stoicism. You're not going to turn to religious beliefs to save you from the misery that is external. There's no reason to. The external is good. You may still have religion. You may still, have the same philosophies, but you don't have to rely on them quite as much. And they don't demand as much of you. They aren't the solution, right? They aren't the only possible solution that you can see. And this kind of explains something that Friedman, a couple of years after writing this book, really came out in favor of. He was like the biggest gung-ho supporter of the Arab Spring movement, and we can see how that pretty much flopped. You know, in most of the countries, it just kind of fizzled out. In the countries where there was some real success, like Libya, for example, it's turned into a chaotic hellhole. I mean, you know, it's just combat and civil war constantly. In Egypt, they put an Islamicist in charge. That was their democratic solution, and you know, then there was a military coup eventually. So there are places where democracy is just not ready to spring. I mean, Pakistan had democracy for a while. They failed. You know, the roots aren't there. And we don't know how to plant them. That's kind of the problem. People there want the opportunities. There's quite a few people who want to be liberal Democrats, whatever, and you know, have elections and have a country where it's not might makes right only, and it's also not a theocracy, but that's not where the strength lies. The strength lies in those fundamental movements, and unfortunately, it sometimes feels like it is going the same way here. That we're moving more and more in that direction, but be that as it may, he did get a few things wrong though, or at least didn't adequately predict things. So one is in India. Now, India is still doing well in terms of business, etc., but I don't think he didn't succeed in showing the kind of Hindu nationalist movement moving forward. That was not his vision. Just like he was optimistic about the Arab Spring, he was optimistic about things like India and China here. Optimistic in the sense of the globalization and the the chains that bind the countries together through it make war more and more difficult. And what that means is that it's kind of in the best interest of the world as a whole, if it wants to be peaceful and, you know, not degrade into war, although the challenges there are going to be quite high, because areas of the world are just going to start becoming unlivable. You know, it's already, you know, there's already places where it's getting there. California. But yeah, there's much worse than California. God, some days I hate having the pavilion in the park right behind me. It's the pavilion that's the problem. If I was further in one way or another down the block, it wouldn't be a problem, but it's right behind my house. And now I'm lost. I can't even fucking remember what I was going to say because there was the intrusion of human voices. This is why I can't work in an office. So let me think. Let me try to think. I don't know. I know that I went off on a tangent from the Indian Hindi nationalist party, and Modi has started doing things. Oh, I was on the peace side of things. Modi has started doing things that you know, are not necessarily moving the ball forward as much. Now, it doesn't really seem to be hurting the business environment in India. He's managed to keep deregulation and whatnot online, but there's some danger there that was not predicted in this book particularly. The other, and far more serious, is the impact of Xi in China. Up until Xi, China had been moving more and more towards a sort of a, hey, let's figure out how to have an authoritarian, you know, let's have our authoritarian government, keep calling it communism, but promote more and more capitalism. Now, and sort of tone back the more nationalistic um, incentives that China had. I don't know, instead of directions, whatever. I can't find the word. But those goals were being pushed over to the side in exchange for this modernization and linking uh, into the capitalist markets, and making themselves a part of the world supply chain in a major way, and becoming an exporter, and all these other things, just really, really pushing further and further towards that, and becoming more friendly towards foreign investment. But now she is not at all opposed to any of that, and in fact really likes, the weird kind of compromise deal that China had gotten, where they could kind of do all kinds of things that were bad practices, etc. But hey, it's in the name of global. You can't afford to piss us off globalization-wise because we're all linked together. But he's started to add some of the nationalism back in, quite a bit of it, in fact, where the Hong Kong move, Hong Kong turning fully Chinese had been, that was slated. Britain couldn't go back on that, but it had been progressing in a way that seemed reasonable. And since she's taken over, there's been just this crackdown. It's not special anymore, or it's less special. And then his moves in Taiwan, his moves in the South China Sea, his moves against Japan, just across the board showing that kind of nationalistic goals. And maybe the weakening of those. I'm not that familiar with the internals of China's politics. The one place I was kind of getting. There was this weird newspaper that supported Trump, by the way. This Chinese group that supported Trump and supported Xi, but was hated Deng Xiaoping and everything he stood for, and saw him as a criminal, basically. But I was getting their propaganda newspaper regularly. It would show up downtown for whatever reason. They had their boxes here and developed it. But and I don't remember what they're called. Somebody may know it. They've been in the news a couple of years ago or so. But that was the only sort of feed in, other than whatever I got from the mainstream media, that I could really get any information from. And some of the media stuff is useful. Like there's I can't remember, Armanpour and Company or whatever, that brings in people and discusses in detail their work, etc. Where you get historians and think tank people and whatever coming in and expressing their view, and sometimes they're not all the same, and they're given a nice chance to describe what they're talking about in a way that most television interviews don't really do a good job of. These really kind of dig in and let them tell their own story rather than challenging it everywhere. I'm not saying that they don't bring forward challenges, but it's on a mellow level. Kind of like Charlie Rose, I like to think was, but Charlie Rose was so fucking boring I couldn't cope with it. These, I don't know, maybe I'm just older and can deal with boring better. But yeah, I mean, he totally missed that China would double back and become, and see its strategic national interests to be and not ones. So things like what is it, the new Silk Road or whatever it is, the Belt Line. I don't remember the Belt Road or whatever that they're trying to create. Things like that would fit in perfectly with this, and with their trying to influence Africa and control Africa through projects and debt and whatnot. That would all fit in perfectly. That kind of strategic national interest makes sense. What didn't is things like Taiwan, will be ours, and this kind of stuff was the kind of stuff that's too close to pushing towards war, and pushing towards war was defeating the real interests, the real strategic interests that were at play, and would actually be a negative. But what I don't know is whether or not essentially Xi's rise to power came out of a little power play having to do with we're becoming kind of the West's and globalized world's pawn more than a real national country. And of course, that kind of thing could be problematic within their Politburo or whatever they have. I don't know what the fuck they have. But yeah, I mean, there could have been political plays, and if he goes back on that, he would lose his support and not be able to be dictator for life, which is apparently part of the thing, one of those things that's being pulled back. And also, he didn't take a look at Putin in Russia particularly. Even at this point, certainly by this point, there was enough information on Putin to realize that, this guy kind of did some stuff that's pretty fucking questionable. I mean, first of all, KGB, but beyond that, I mean, you can say, well, Bush was CIA, so. But yeah, the apartment bombings had already happened. The Chechen War, the total destruction there. I don't think Georgia was a couple years coming still. But this sort of someone who seems to have had leverage on Yeltsin, but then again, Friedman was not really, his center of interest had been in the Near East all along, I think. So, the geopolitical stuff, I don't blame, nobody can be prescient in all things and whatever, but this book kind of fails. And that's part of the amusement, is looking and seeing, oh, this is what at least some people were thinking back then. All expressed clearly and consolidated in one place about, these kind of influences. And now there's been enough time, a good 15 years, to look back and say, well, and that kind of thing is just intriguing to me, and that's why I pick up any book that I see anywhere, that at all kind of interests me, and that's why I have too many damn books, and now I don't pick up any more, unless they're like old science fiction writers that I recognize, which we'll come to in my next installment. But anyway, I figured I'd chatter and whatever, because people wanted these book things for some reason. Some people wanted them. And it's not like I have other people to hang out with and chatter about these things with. And the camera's a captive audience, even if you're not. So cheers.